My favorite pair of shoes were called Superfly shoes. They were platform shoes. They were suede. They had a white stitch, and they had a high platform and a high heel. And everyone on Soul Train had them. And what made them special was because they were the same shoes that were worn in the Superfly movie back in the early 70s. So being a young kid of the 70s, I had to have a pair. And my uncle took me downtown in Maryland and bought me a pair of these Superfly shoes. And of course, the rest is history. Looking back in history, in terms of wearing someone else's shoes, I would have to say it would have to be Mr. Mountain. And Mr. Mountain was my algebra teacher in high school. He was one of the few black males in high school that came back to the neighborhood in Baltimore and taught in the city schools. I really didn't realize the impact that he had on my life until later on in life. That I see that I emulated some of his characteristics in terms of leadership, responsibility, and the importance of education. Looking back on it now, I wish I would have spent more time listening to Mr. Mountain. But he clearly impacted my life in ways that I didn't realize until later in life. So Mr. Mountain is probably the one that I would step in his shoes. What I've learned is that one set of individuals in my past that has impacted me are the teachers that have made a huge impact. Say joining the military was probably one of the obstacles I had to overcome. Meaning, there was only a few people in my family that had joined the military. By the time I came along, a lot of them had left the military and went on in other careers. But when it was time for me to select a career field, I decided to join the military. And it was a huge obstacle for me because there were very few African-American males in the Marine Corps at the time. It's not that there weren't any, but there were just a few. And so it was a culture that I had to get to understand. It was learning a lot of things new, how to march, how to talk, how to speak, and also to understand other cultures. You know, there were people from the South, there were people from the Midwest, there were those from the inner cities. And we all came together and we had to work together. That was something that I had never experienced. Of course, I was a long way from home. And so that was a major hurdle that I had to overcome. Once I got in the military, what I realized is that there were expectations for African Americans, meaning, folks said that African Americans traditionally do this, they don't do this. And, one of them is that they don't swim. Coming from the inner city, a lot of African Americans did not swim. And so I had the unique opportunity to learn how to swim. And so breaking down those ideas of what African Americans were was probably a huge challenge for me. And so I tried my best to represent, the culture well by helping break down stereotypes. But it was not easy. So I'll start with the end. So currently I serve as the president of the Virginia Black History Month Association. And what led me to that position is, again, my experience in the military. One of the things that the militaries and the federal government has to do is to celebrate the different cultural holidays. Of course, in February is Black History Month. So when I came to this area, Spotsylvania, Quantico, and Fredericksburg, one of the things I noticed is that there was nothing, I shouldn't say nothing, but on the base, there was nothing that celebrated Black History Month other than choirs singing songs and serving soul food at the chow hall. And I went to the leadership of the base and I said, African Americans have contributed more to this country than songs and soul food. I said, give me permission to demonstrate to the community some of the positive achievements of African Americans and allow me to bring the families in this area to a formal event. They liked the idea and gave me the opportunity to put together a small group of volunteers to plan an event to highlight more of the achievements of African Americans. To make a long story short, I was able to bring in Howard University Theater and Arts, and I brought in a guest speaker. And to our surprise, we had, this group of volunteers had hit a niche because there were so many people that showed up at our event that we were forced to turn folks away at the door. And to our surprise, there were people of Asian, Hispanic, and African American communities that attended. Because our approach was to highlight the positive achievements of African Americans in a positive setting. So fast forward 16 years later, the daughter of Martin Luther King is our keynote speaker. And we have over 700 people in the Fredericksburg area attending our event. And we're bringing in all the minority businesses to let the community know that there are some Black-owned businesses that probably don't get as much attention traditionally outside of February. So we have this event every year that is widely attended. And as a result of that, we have done some other activities. When Trayvon Martin was murdered in Florida, our organization decided to do a town hall meeting to give the community an opportunity to voice their opinions. It wasn't to do anything else more than that. And once again, the community came and more than 300 people attended, and they got an opportunity to talk about what they were feeling. As a result of that, other social activities and social events have transpired. But it has now allowed me the opportunity to work with the community about some of the things that are unique to the African American community. So today now I sit in this chair as the president of a small group of volunteers whose sole purpose is to unify a community that was so unified so many years ago. So what brought me here was I had an opportunity to come back to the East Coast. At the time I was in the military, I was stationed in California, and my father-in-law was ill, and so we had an opportunity to come east. And so I talked with my wife, and we all made the decision to come east. And we were living on the Quantico base, and we were looking for a place to live. And my wife saw something in the paper about an area called Fredericksburg, in particular Spotsylvania. So we looked at some property and we built a home in Spotsylvania. And that's where we live today. Over the years, I guess, you can say that I had the opportunity to stand on the shoulders of those that went before me. And so the military and the African American community have sort of galvanized a pathway for me to aspire to get an education. So with all that, I decided to go back to school. I went to the University of Maryland and pursued a degree in psychology. And so after my degree in psychology, again, in this area, once I had to retire from the military, or it was time to retire, I knew I needed a master's degree. So I had an opportunity to go to Johns Hopkins University in their engineering department, and I was accepted into Johns Hopkins engineering department. And so I received a master's degree in systems engineering from Johns Hopkins. It didn't stop there. I knew to be competitive, I needed some other education because at this point, I became the president of a small nonprofit organization. So I knew I needed more skills to run an organization. So I returned back to school for a Master's of Business Association in particularly managing a business. So today I'm pursuing my MBA and I'm more than halfway done. Over the years in my term in the military, some of the things that I have accomplished, like any other military serviceman, I had the unique opportunity to serve my country in some overseas tours. My first time overseas was in Beirut, Lebanon. And that was clearly life-changing for me because it was the first time that I saw someone of another country. And I remember seeing a black person in a different uniform in Beirut. We were there to keep the peace. And so I approached this individual with a lot of enthusiasm because, you know, there weren't a lot of African Americans in Beirut. So I greeted him, you know, say, hello, how are you doing? You know, it's nice to see, you know, another African American. And he spoke French and didn't speak English. And so that sort of broadened my horizon in terms of that there are blacks in other locations other than the United States. So that was eye-opening for me. As a result of my time in Beirut and my time in the Gulf War and coming back and serving in another war, I have just accumulated a number of medals and awards for my time in the military. In 2003, I retired from the Marine Corps with an honorable discharge, and I went to work in the civilian sector. Today, I work for the Marine Corps as a government civilian, as a management analyst, you know, managing different military programs. But I contribute all of that to my upbringing in Maryland and those that have paved the way for me never to give up, to continue moving forward. And regardless of how bad things may seem, I always knew that my forefathers had an even more difficult challenge, and they depended on me to do well and to capitalize on the contributions that they had made for me to succeed. So that's been my goal, is to succeed and to pass on to those behind me the mantle to carry forward in this mission to be successful and to represent the African American community in a positive way. So my next mission is to build a legacy for the next generation of African Americans. You know, even though today we have an African American president, African Americans have succeeded in so many different areas of science, space, success in the military, and other functional areas. There is still a lot of work to do. So my mission now is to help the next generation to reach a milestone where a color becomes no longer a barrier. You know, one of the things that I hope to leave behind is a sense of unity within the African American community, which is one of the things that I hope to achieve with this Black History Month association. You know, there's never a time other than February, which is Black History Month, that African Americans need to come together and pay tribute to those that have went before them. And so what I realize is that it is just not for African Americans, but for Americans in general. You know, African American history really is part of American history. So my goal is to leave a legacy to those behind us, for them to continue on and to remember the sacrifices that were made for all of us to achieve. You know, like I have told many people before, there are few leaders in this country that have done more than the pastors in this area and the educators in this area. You know, the pastors have always been a leader in the African American community, and so have the teachers. Those two together have probably contributed more to this country than any other occupation. So my hopes is that those two communities will come together and galvanize and add something to the next generation that will continue on in this legacy of striving to do better. You know, as I look at the generations of young African Americans and I see them with their trousers hanging down and other things, I know that they're dealing with a different type of culture that I grew up with. But I believe that our community can galvanize and instill in them the same values and the same traditions that we've had in the past that will help them to see and understand that education is the key that unlocks any of the doors or challenges that you have. So, you know, it's my mission to continue to pass on the legacy and to help the next generation to understand the beauty of the culture in which they live. 5 kids, 2 girls, 3 boys. Yes, all of them. It's always their birthdays. Since we were military and we didn't have our family around us, we made birthdays special. And so, what we try to do is pull out all stops and celebrate their birthdays. And one of the things that I realized that I needed to do with my girls is to try to be an example to them of what a good husband should be. And so we would go on our play dates and we would dance on these play dates. Those probably are one of our most memorable times that I've spent together with my girls. Just recently, the oldest, who is a doctor, recently married. And so I had the chance to walk her down the aisle and to pass on to her, that tradition of dancing with her husband. And it was a pleasure to see her and her husband dancing together for the first time.